The soft amber glow of the dawn had not yet broken over the moss-draped oaks of Savannah, Georgia, but the kitchen of Vance's hearth was already alive. At 4:30 a.m., the air inside the artisanal bakery was heavy with the comforting, rich scent of fermenting flour and warming butter. Eleanor Vance stood alone by the massive wooden prep table, her slender frame silhouetted against the ambient light of the commercial ovens. She leaned her weight forward, pressing the palms of her hands into a dense mass of sourdough. As she pushed, a familiar, blinding streak of numbness shot up from her wrists, radiating straight through her forearms. Eleanor gasped softly, pulling her hands back and cradling her right wrist against her chest. It was advanced carpal tunnel syndrome, a harsh souvenir from 15 years of relentless manual labor, kneading thousands of loaves to build the bakery's reputation. She had secretly received the definitive medical diagnosis from her specialist just last week. The doctor's words had been clinical and absolute. Her hands could no longer sustain this level of physical strain without risking permanent nerve damage. Yet, Eleanor had locked the diagnostic reports away in a gray folder, keeping her agonizing pain entirely to herself. She was waiting. She had poured $20,000 of her own hard-earned savings into a luxurious, all-inclusive 15th anniversary cruise, scheduled to depart that very afternoon from Miami. That cruise was supposed to be her sanctuary, the quiet space where she could finally break the news to her husband, step away from the grueling kitchen routine, and figure out the next chapter of their lives together. Eleanor shook out her hands, trying to restore sensation to her fingertips, and forced herself to look around the kitchen she had built from scratch. For a decade and a half, this had been her life. She was the definition of the invisible wife, the anchor that kept the entire Vance family afloat while remaining completely unseen. She was the one who woke up before dawn every single day, managing the bakery's grueling schedule to ensure the household bills were paid on time. When her stepdaughter Chloe needed her college tuition covered after losing a partial scholarship, it was Eleanor who quietly signed the checks without a second thought. When Thomas needed financial backing for his landscape architecture firm during the lean years, Eleanor's bakery account was the silent safety net. Yet, in return for her absolute devotion, she had been systematically erased. Thomas practiced a refined, insidious form of emotional abuse, a suffocating cold violence that manifested in calculated silence and profound indifference. To Thomas, Eleanor was not a partner. She was a utility, a permanent piece of kitchen machinery that existed solely to fund his lifestyle and maintain the household. He spoke to her only when he needed a financial guarantee or a chore completed. Her presence was tolerated, her sacrifices expected, and her emotional needs completely ignored. She had become a ghost in her own home, a background figure in the grand story Thomas constructed for himself. At 5:15 a.m., the sharp, digital buzz of her smartphone shattered the morning quiet of the bakery. Eleanor wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and picked up the device from the counter. A text message from Thomas filled the screen. Eleanor read the words once. Then she read them again, the text blurring slightly before her eyes. Plans changed. You need to stay behind and run the bakery this week. There's no room for you on this trip anymore. Chloe wants a real family vacation with her biological mother, Lydia. We're heading out to the airport now. The phone felt heavy, almost metallic, in her hand. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, her gaze drifting to the corner where her packed, gray suitcase stood ready by the door. On the prep table next to it sat the supplementary credit card she had dutifully issued to Thomas years ago, so he would never have to worry about travel expenses. A real family vacation. The phrase cut deeper than any physical blade ever could. Chloe, the girl she had raised, packed lunches for, and comforted through teenage heartbreak since the age of 7, had effortlessly discarded her the moment Lydia, the biological mother who had abandoned her for over a decade to pursue a reckless, self-serving lifestyle, showed up with a handful of empty promises. And Thomas, the man whose debt she had managed, had seamlessly rewritten the narrative of their marriage, pushing Eleanor out of the very holiday she paid for, just to play the role of the doting father and reconstituted family man. A profound, echoing silence settled over Eleanor's mind. But this time, the silence didn't feel like the heavy weight of submission. It felt like an icy, crystallizing clarity. For 15 years, she had operated under the delusion that if she just worked a little harder, sacrificed a little more, and absorbed the cold shoulder with enough grace, she would finally be granted the status of real family. Now, staring at the glowing screen, she realized the devastating truth. You cannot earn a place at a table where you were only ever viewed as the servant. She did not cry. She did not drop the phone. Nor did she feel the urge to drive frantically to the airport to scream, beg, or cause a scene that Thomas could easily weaponize to label her as unstable. The years of enduring his cold indifference had already broken the emotional tether long before this text ever arrived. The text hadn't broken her marriage. It had simply made the invisible fractures impossible to ignore. With steady, deliberate movements, Eleanor set her coffee mug down on the wooden counter. Her swollen fingers no longer trembled. She unlocked her phone, pulled up the chat thread, and meticulously typed out a response. Exactly 3 words. Enjoy the trip. She pressed send. Without waiting for a typing bubble or a defensive follow-up, Eleanor held down the power button and shut the phone off completely, plunging the screen into total darkness. She took off her flour-stained apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. Walking over to the wall phone, she lifted the receiver and dialed a number she had kept memorized for years. As the line began to ring on the other end, Eleanor looked out the front window of the bakery. The very first faint sliver of dawn was finally creeping over the Savannah horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the cobblestone street. "Samuel," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a calm, resonant register as her attorney answered the phone. "It's Eleanor Vance. I need you to initiate the paperwork we discussed. It's time to move the house and the business out of the maybe pile. I'm ready to take my life back." Samuel Hayes's law office in downtown Savannah was exactly as Eleanor expected, quiet, orderly, and smelling faintly of old parchment and leather. By 8:30 a.m., while Thomas, Chloe, and Lydia were likely boarding their flight to Miami, Eleanor was already signing the first wave of directives. She sat across from Samuel, her bandaged wrists resting on the mahogany desk. There was no hesitation in her eyes. The 3 words she had texted to Thomas, "Enjoy the trip," were not an angry declaration. They were the initiation of a meticulously engineered exit strategy. The first phase of the plan focused on immediate financial insulation, leveraging the precision of Georgia's property and financial laws. Samuel worked quickly on his computer, systematically cutting the financial lifeline Eleanor had provided for 15 years. Under Eleanor's explicit instruction, Samuel contacted the cruise line's corporate office. Because the initial $20,000 reservation had been booked under Eleanor's primary account, she legally withdrew her name as the financial guarantor for the remainder of the trip. The cruise line immediately transferred the open, unpaid balances for premium onshore excursions, beverage packages, and port fees directly to Thomas's name. Next, Eleanor closed the joint checking account she had funded with the bakery's profits. With a few clicks, Samuel officially revoked every supplementary credit card issued under her primary line, effectively rendering Thomas's and Chloe's secondary cards useless pieces of plastic. She was no longer financing a family that chose to make her invisible. The second phase was the tactical upgrade of her professional life. For months, the agonizing pain of her carpal tunnel syndrome had whispered a harsh truth. She could not knead dough forever. Instead of letting her physical injury dictate her defeat, Eleanor had used the last 2 months to quietly negotiate with a major regional hospitality conglomerate interested in the Vance's Hearth brand. She called the acquisition director from Samuel's office and advanced the closing date of the contract to that very morning. By 10 a.m., the deal was finalized. Eleanor legally sold an 80% stake in the physical bakery operations, securing a massive financial windfall that anchored her future. More importantly, she retained a 20% share of the intellectual property, transitioning seamlessly from a grueling kitchen labor into a highly compensated master recipe consultant. Her new contract dictated that she would only oversee flavor profiles and brand expansion from a corporate desk, completely protecting her damaged nerves while elevating her status from an invisible baker to a celebrated culinary mind. The final and most dramatic piece of the strategy involved the marital home, a beautiful historic property in Savannah's historic district. To ensure the story remained entirely bulletproof against U.S. property laws and to avoid any illegal lockout lawsuits, Samuel had verified the ironclad prenup Eleanor's grandmother had insisted upon 15 years ago. The house was strictly Eleanor's separate property, and Thomas had signed a waiver of marital homestead rights during a refinancing cycle years prior. The house had actually been placed under contract with a verified cash buyer 4 weeks earlier as part of Eleanor's retirement planning. Eleanor authorized Samuel to expedite the closing. The deed transfer was finalized, and the official closing date was legally locked for the 8th day of Thomas's cruise, the exact midpoint of his vacation. Eleanor had no intention of being cruel, but she was fiercely committed to her new boundaries. She refused to leave their personal belongings exposed or create a petty spectacle on the lawn. Instead, she hired a premier, white-glove moving company. Over the next 3 days, professional movers arrived at the property with high-definition cameras, systematically cataloging every single item that belonged exclusively to Thomas and Chloe. Every piece of clothing, every photograph, and every personal memento was wrapped in protective foam, packed into heavy-duty boxes, and transported to a secure, climate-controlled storage facility on the outskirts of Savannah. Eleanor paid for 2 full months of storage rent in advance, including comprehensive premium insurance coverage. By the time the movers finished, the house was immaculate, empty, and ready for its new owners. Eleanor walked through the vacant rooms one last time, feeling the strange, liberating lightness of a space cleared of heavy expectations. She returned to Samuel's office to sign the final divorce petition. Samuel placed the legal envelope on the desk. It contained the official divorce papers, the keys to the storage unit, the paid rental receipts, and a small stack of emergency cash for a hotel. "Everything is legally binding, Eleanor," Samuel said, sliding the envelope into a courier pouch. "The court server will digitize these files and send the official notifications to Thomas's legal representation today. By law, they have no claim to the property, and their belongings are safely secured." Eleanor nodded, a quiet sense of triumph settling in her chest. She had not broken a single law, nor had she acted out of blind rage. She had simply constructed an impenetrable boundary. As she left the law office, she left behind the invisible wife who suffered in silence, replaced by a woman who managed her life with the cold, flawless precision of a master architect. The sun beat down mercilessly on the upper deck of the luxury cruise liner as it glided across the turquoise waters of the Atlantic, miles away from the coast of Miami. On the outside, Thomas, Chloe, and Lydia presented the flawless image of a picture-perfect American family enjoying a high-end vacation. They sat at a reserved poolside table, sipping premium cocktails and laughing under the tropical sun. But beneath the sun-drenched facade, the air was thick with tension. The vacancy left by Eleanor's absence was palpable, though Thomas stubbornly refused to acknowledge it, instead overcompensating by playing the role of the generous, wealthy provider. The illusion held together until the afternoon of the fourth day, when the ship docked at a tropical port of call for a scheduled midway transit. Eager to impress Lydia and indulge Chloe's taste for luxury, Thomas led them to the ship's concierge desk to book an exclusive, high-end private shore excursion and upgrade their dining package to the vintage steakhouse. The concierge calculated the premium additions and politely requested a credit card to clear the open balance and secure the reservation. Thomas smiled confidently, reaching into his leather wallet. He pulled out the heavy titanium supplementary card that Eleanor had issued to him years ago and slid it across the counter. The concierge swiped the card. A sharp, high-pitched beep echoed from the terminal. The screen flashed a bright red notification. "I'm sorry, sir," the concierge said, his voice dropping into a professional yet guarded tone. "The transaction was declined. It appears this secondary line has been officially revoked by the primary account holder." Thomas frowned, his affluent veneer cracking slightly. "That's impossible. Try it again. It's an unlimited corporate line." The concierge swiped it a second time, only for the red text to reappear. He checked his system monitor and added, "Furthermore, the primary guarantor for this cabin has withdrawn their financial backing. The remaining unpaid room balance, port fees, and incidentals must be settled immediately with an alternative form of payment, or your shipboard privileges will be suspended at the next port." Panic flared in Thomas's chest. He pulled out 3 other credit cards, all supplementary lines tied to Eleanor's bakery business accounts, but each one returned the same devastating result: declined. Eleanor had completely cut the financial cord. Attempting to save face in front of the line of passengers waiting behind them, Thomas turned to Lydia, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Honey, there must be a glitch with our business bank back in Savannah. Do you mind putting your card down for the room balance and the excursion? I'll wire the funds from my personal account as soon as we get internet access." Lydia's glamorous, carefree expression instantly froze. Her wealthy, jet-setting persona shattered in an instant under the cold light of financial scrutiny. She hesitated, fumbling through her designer purse before reluctantly handing over a glossy gold card. The concierge ran it. Declined. She handed over another. Declined. The concierge leaned forward, speaking quietly. "Sir, ma'am, these accounts are flagged by the merchant network. They are currently frozen due to outstanding tax liens and severe delinquency." The truth was out. Lydia's sudden, passionate return into Chloe's life had nothing to do with maternal instinct. She was drowning in gambling debts and facing a barrage of lawsuits. She had targeted Thomas because she believed he was a wealthy architecture mogul, completely unaware that his lavish lifestyle was entirely subsidized by the quiet, invisible woman he had left behind in Georgia. With both adult accounts dry, the crushing weight of reality fell squarely on the youngest member of the group. The ship's security officer was called to the desk, insisting that the balance be settled before anyone could return to their rooms. Terrified of being humiliated and stranded in a foreign port, Chloe was forced to pull out her own debit card. With a trembling hand, she authorized the transaction, watching in horror as the machine drained her entire life savings, the exact fund Eleanor had meticulously helped her build and protect for her upcoming graduate school tuition. The moment they returned to their suite, the final remnants of the dream family vacation collapsed into chaos. The silent, cold violence that Thomas and Chloe had practiced against Eleanor for 15 years suddenly reversed its direction, turning inward. The suite became a war zone of toxic screaming matches. Lydia lashed out first, dropping her high society accent and viciously mocking Thomas for being a fraud. She called him a pathetic parasite who had lived like a king off the blood and sweat of a second wife he wasn't even smart enough to keep. Thomas, blinded by rage and humiliation, shot back, exposing Lydia as an opportunistic, deadbeat mother who had abandoned her own daughter for a decade, and only crawled back to leech off his assumed wealth. Chloe sat in the corner of the lavish cabin, clutching her knees, listening to the vicious insults flying between the two biological parents she had idolized. The money for her future was gone, paid to cover the vanity of a father who owned nothing and a mother who cared for nothing but herself. As the cruise liner sailed back into the dark Atlantic waters, the atmosphere inside the room grew freezing cold. For the rest of the voyage, nobody took photos, nobody smiled, and nobody spoke. They were trapped together on a luxury ship, forced to look into the mirror and face the hollow, ugly reality of the choices they had made. The transition from the sun-bleached decks of the cruise liner to the humid reality of Georgia was a long, suffocating descent into absolute silence. Inside the cramped confines of the taxi, the air was dense, thick with the sharp, acidic tang of cheap air freshener and the stale, suffocating heat of trapped midday air. Thomas sat in the front seat, his knuckles pressed so hard against the cracked leather dashboard that his skin turned a brittle, bloodless white. In the back, Chloe stared blankly out the window, her fingers twitching rhythmically against the hollow plastic of her purse, while Lydia slumped in the opposite corner, the chemical scent of her expensive perfume curdling in the stifling temperature. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of the tires against the asphalt, a low-toned vibration that rattled their teeth and amplified the crushing dread settling in their chests. When the car finally turned onto the familiar cobblestone street of Savannah's historic district, a collective, involuntary gasp caught in their throats. The humid air outside was heavy with the sweet, cloying fragrance of blooming magnolias and damp earth, a scent that had spelled comfort for 15 years. But as the taxi ground to a halt against the curb, the sensory safety of the neighborhood vanished. The house, Eleanor's house, was not the dark, shuttered sanctuary they had expected to find. The grand, heavy oak front doors, which Eleanor used to polish until the grain gleamed like dark honey, were thrown wide open. The sharp mechanical screech of a moving truck's hydraulic lift shattered the quiet afternoon. A large, yellow commercial vehicle sat squarely in the driveway, its exhaust pipe coughing out thick, gray plumes of diesel smoke that scratched the back of Thomas's throat. A young family was laughing on the porch, their voices bright and jarringly clear in the humid air. Two small children were already racing across the lawn, the metallic ring of their bicycle bells cutting through the humid atmosphere, while their dog barked excitedly, its paws tearing up the neatly manicured turf. New, unfamiliar linen curtains of a stark, clinical white hung in the front windows where Eleanor's warm, hand-woven drapes used to be, the home Eleanor had maintained. The very structure they had assumed would always be waiting to catch them had completely transformed under the hands of total strangers. Thomas threw open the taxi door, the metal handle hot enough to sting his palm. He stormed up the brick walkway, his heavy boots clicking erratically against the stone, his face contorted in a mask of raw, defensive fury. He began shouting, his voice cracking as he demanded to know what these intruders were doing with his property. The young father on the porch flinched, his laughter dying instantly, replaced by a defensive posture. The confrontation escalated in a flurry of heated words until the sharp, rhythmic wail of a police siren cut through the air. A local Savannah police cruiser pulled up to the curb, its blue and red lights casting hyper-bright, disorienting strobes across the historic brick facades. Two officers stepped out, their heavy leather utility belts creaking with every step as they intercepted Thomas before he could cross the threshold. Thomas's voice rose to a desperate, shrill pitch, claiming he was the legal resident and that his wife had locked him out in an act of malicious spite. The officers remained detached, their faces unreadable under the brims of their hats. One officer stepped onto the porch, conversing in low tones with the new homeowner, who quickly vanished inside, and returned with a crisp, multi-page legal document. It bore the heavy, embossed gold seal of the Chatham County Courthouse, dated and finalized exactly 4 days prior. A clean, cash-close transaction. The officer reviewed the paperwork, the heavy paper rustling loudly in the quiet street. He turned back to Thomas, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Sir, this property has been legally transferred, and the closing process is entirely complete. You have no legal title, no equity, and no right of residency here. If you do not step off this private property immediately, you will be placed under arrest for criminal trespass." Thomas stood frozen on the grass, the hyperbright police lights reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. He was entirely exposed, stripped of his affluent veneer under the watchful, whispering gazes of the neighbors who had gathered at their windows. Seeing the finality in the officer's stance, the new homeowner stepped down from the porch. He looked at Thomas not with anger, but with a deeply uncomfortable, gut-wrenching pity. He reached into his pocket and handed over a thick, heavy courier envelope made of coarse Tyvek. "The real estate attorney left this for you," the man said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "He said you'd be arriving today." Thomas stumbled back to the sidewalk where Chloe and Lydia stood like statues. With clumsy, trembling fingers, he tore open the synthetic envelope, the sharp rip of the plastic sounding like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. Inside lay a thick stack of crisp $100 bills, cold, clean, and smelling faintly of fresh ink, sufficient to cover a 2-week stay at a nearby boutique hotel. Beneath the cash were the storage facility keys, the paid rental receipts, and the official divorce petition drafted by Samuel Hayes. But tucked at the very bottom of the packet were 2 items that completely decimated their remaining emotional defense: a copy of Eleanor's official neurological medical reports and her personal, leather-bound recipe journal. Chloe lunged forward, her fingers tearing the journal away from her father's limp grasp. The old leather was soft, worn smooth by years of contact with Eleanor's skin, and it still carried the faint, bittersweet aroma of vanilla extract and roasted espresso beans. She opened the heavy cotton pages, expecting to find columns of numbers or dry legal terms. Instead, she found a handwritten map of an invisible life. Eleanor's elegant, flowing cursive script filled the pages, but as Chloe's eyes scanned down, she noticed the handwriting in the later entries altered drastically. The letters became jagged, smaller, and visibly shaky, the ink pooling heavily where Eleanor's sung-tae swollen. Fingers had lost their grip on the pen. Chloe read the words aloud, her voice cracking as the sensory details hit her. "Thomas's sourdough starter. Use only the low-glycemic, unbleached flour blend. His prediabetes flares up if the fermentation is rushed. The acidity must be balanced. Knead gently for 20 minutes, even when the wrists ache, to ensure the crumb remains light for him." On the following page, the ink was slightly smudged, as if a tear or a drop of sweat had fallen on the paper. "Chloe's exam weeks. Bake the organic oat and lavender cookies on Tuesday nights. The lavender must be fresh ground. She gets severe, suffocating anxiety before finals, and the scent of lavender in the morning air helps ground her senses before she walks into the classroom. Do not let her see you making them. She hates feeling fussed over, and she must believe the comfort happens naturally." The realization hit the 3 of them like a violent, physical blow to the sternum. The very hands they had ignored, the woman they had treated as a silent financial utility, had been documenting their health, managing their hidden illnesses, and comforting their unspoken anxieties in the dark, enduring agonizing physical pain to protect them. They had traded a woman who loved them in the quiet, agonizing texture of everyday life for a superficial, debt-ridden dream that had evaporated on the ocean. Chloe collapsed entirely onto her knees on the hard concrete pavement, clutching the smooth leather journal to her chest, her body shaking with violent, ragged sobs as the crushing weight of her own ingratitude completely broke her. For months later, the suffocating humidity of Savannah was replaced by the crisp, freezing air of an Atlanta winter. The setting was the grand, cavernous banquet hall of a luxury hotel, a space defined by the blinding glare of crystal chandeliers, the sharp clink of expensive champagne flutes, and the low, echoing murmur of high society chatter mixed with smooth jazz. It was the official launch gala for the regional hospitality conglomerate's new premium artisanal line, and the star of the evening was Eleanor Vance, the newly appointed master recipe consultant. The air in the ballroom was crisp, smelling of expensive floral arrangements and roasted prime rib. Thomas and Chloe, dressed in clothes that had grown noticeably looser on their frames over the last 4 months, managed to slip past the velvet ropes of the reception desk. Their eyes scanned the glittering crowd until they locked onto the corporate banner at the far end of the hall. There stood Eleanor. She looked radiant, completely detached from the exhausted, flour-dusted woman they had left behind in the bakery. She wore a perfectly tailored, cream-colored silk suit that caught the light of the chandeliers. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the sharp, confident lines of her jaw. Her skin looked healthy, no longer washed out by the heat of the commercial ovens. The only physical remnant of her past life was a sleek, low-profile medical wrist brace made of matte black carbon fiber, stabilizing her right hand. She stood comfortably, holding a glass of sparkling water, radiating an effortless, impenetrable dignity. Thomas stepped forward, his boots heavy against the polished marble floor. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his voice carrying a volatile mix of desperation and wounded pride that cut through the ambient jazz music. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice sharp enough to cause several nearby executives to turn their heads. "You ruthlessly erased 15 years of marriage over a single text message. You sold the roof over our heads, packed our lives into a dark storage locker, and ran away to play corporate star while your family was left with nothing? How can you stand there and be so heartless?" Eleanor did not flinch. She did not look around the room in embarrassment, nor did she lower her eyes to avoid his gaze. She turned slowly, the silk of her suit rustling softly, and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. Her expression was entirely neutral, not angry, not vengeful, but filled with a quiet, devastating clarity. The space around them seemed to drop in temperature, freezing the air between them. "Thomas," Eleanor began, her voice perfectly calm, resonant, and entirely devoid of theatrics. "For 15 years, I woke up at 4 a.m. every single morning. I breathed in the heat of the ovens, I managed the debt of your firm, and I kept our household afloat while my hands were turning to ice. You watched me rub my wrists every single night at the dinner table while you ate the food I provided. Tell me, right now, in front of these people, what is the name of the prescription medication I take to keep the nerves in my hands from dying?" Thomas opened his mouth, his lips parting, but no sound came out. He blinked rapidly, the bright chandelier light catching the sudden sweat breaking out on his forehead. He looked down at the marble floor. He didn't know. He had never once looked close enough to see. Eleanor turned her steady gaze to Chloe, who was trembling behind her father, the scent of the ballroom suddenly making her nauseous. "Chloe," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a softer, heavier register. "You told me at the airport that you needed a holiday with a real family. You chose Lydia's blood. Can you tell me what your biological mother's favorite color is? What is the name of the elementary school she left you at? You can't, because she was never there to give you those details. But, every single burn scar on my forearms, Chloe, because I got them staying up until 3 a.m. in a scorching kitchen, inhaling flour dust, baking 30 identical dummy cakes for your senior design portfolio, so your teachers wouldn't fail you." Eleanor stepped closer, the the subtle scent of her lavender soap hitting Chloe's senses, triggering a visceral memory of the kitchen in Savannah. DNA gives you a biological title, Thomas, but showing up in the dark, absorbing the cold silence, and bearing the physical burns every single day to build a life, that is what makes a family. You never wanted a mother, Chloe. You never wanted a partner, Thomas. You simply wanted a silent cash register that knew how to knead dough. I didn't erase our marriage over a text message. Your text message just forced me to finally look in the mirror and realize that the woman you thought you could leave behind had already vanished. She didn't wait for their tears or their explanations. Eleanor gave them one last, lingering look of profound closure, then turned gracefully on her heel, her silk suit catching the golden light of the ballroom as she walked back toward the stage, leaving them standing entirely alone at the threshold of a life they no longer had the right to touch. The wake-up call delivered on the marble floors of the Atlanta Banquet Hall did not lead to a miraculous overnight reconciliation, nor did it cause Thomas and Chloe to fade into oblivion. Instead, it forced a painful, necessary fracturing of their old habits. For the first time in their lives, the two of them were stripped of the luxury of playing the victim. There was no Eleanor to blame for their discomfort, no silent provider to resent while quietly spending her money. Thomas was the first to face the music of his financial reality. Stripped of the bakery's steady subsidization, his landscape architecture firm was exposed for what it truly was, a struggling boutique business drained by his own vanity. Breaking his lifelong cycle of projecting an affluent facade, Thomas made a radical, conscious shift in his mindset. He stopped waiting for a financial savior and began taking absolute accountability for his lifestyle. He sold his leased European luxury SUV, broke his expensive lease in Savannah's historic district, and moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment near the riverfront. He sat down with a financial advisor, built his very first strict monthly budget, and learned how to cook his own basic meals. He spent his weekends doing manual maintenance on his own drafting equipment, slowly learning the value of the hard labor Eleanor had performed for 15 years. Chloe underwent an equally profound personal evolution. The loss of her graduate school savings was a devastating blow, but instead of retreating into bitterness or relying on her biological mother, she cut ties with Lydia entirely. Realizing that Lydia's temporary affection was a toxic mirage, Chloe took a low-paying, entry-level position as a junior graphic designer at a local marketing agency. She traded her designer clothes for practical workwear, started paying her own health insurance, and began learning the true weight of a dollar. More importantly, she began a disciplined, quiet process of making amends. Every month, she sat at her small desk and wrote a physical, handwritten letter to Eleanor. She did not ask for financial help. She did not beg for Eleanor to return to Savannah. And she did not ask Eleanor to fix a single complication in her new, difficult life. Instead, her letters became an unadorned chronicle of accountability, detailing the small projects she was working on, the budgeting skills she was mastering, and the deep, permanent respect she now held for the woman who had raised her. A full year passed, bringing with it the arrival of the soft, golden autumn of New England. In a historic neighborhood in Boston, the late afternoon sun cast a warm, amber glow across a brick-paved terrace. This was Eleanor's sanctuary. Eleanor sat peacefully in a cushioned armchair on the sun-drenched balcony of her new brownstone. Her life had completely transformed. The grueling, pre-dawn alarms were a memory of the past. Thanks to her corporate consultancy role, her hands had healed remarkably well. The sleek medical brace was gone, replaced by the natural flexibility of joints that were finally allowed to rest. The terrace was dotted with vibrant watercolor paintings of botanical landscapes, a creative passion Eleanor had discovered she possessed once she finally had the time and space to look at her own reflection. As she looked out over the Boston skyline during this peaceful golden hour, she felt entirely light. The anger and the hollow ache of the cold violence she had endured for 15 years had completely dissolved. She didn't hold any malice toward Thomas, nor did she harbor resentment for Lydia. Her calculated departure hadn't been an act of vengeance designed to punish them. It was simply the construction of a beautiful, impenetrable boundary that allowed her to finally belong to herself. She had stopped trying to purchase love with her own suffering. A soft chime from the door announced a scheduled visitor. Chloe stepped out onto the terrace, carrying a small canvas bag. She had flown up from Georgia using the travel points she had earned from her own corporate credit card. Chloe stopped at the threshold, looking at Eleanor standing in the amber light. She looked different too, older, more grounded, her posture reflecting the quiet confidence of a young woman who worked for her own living. She did not run forward to cry, nor did she instantly deploy the word "Mom" as a cheap tool to gain emotional access. She simply offered a respectful, genuine smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me for tea, Eleanor," Chloe said softly, her voice steady and mature. "And thank you for letting me come here without expecting you to fix a single thing in my life." Eleanor smiled, a deep, warm expression of total peace. She poured a fresh cup of chamomile tea and gestured to the empty chair beside her. As the golden hour washed over the terrace, bathing the two women in a warm, forgiving light, they stood together at the railing. There was no pretense, no financial dependency, and no lingering ghosts of the past. They were simply two independent individuals, standing on their own feet, free, proud, and entirely at peace with the new lives they had chosen to build. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. And I will see you on the next page.